The armor was professionalism. The lie was that it was enough. For 243 days, I had worn my ambition like a breastplate, polished to a blinding sheen. My reports were flawless, my projections were uncannily accurate, and my devotion to the firm, to him, was the stuff of quiet legend among the junior analysts. They saw a machine, a ladder climber. They saw the clean lines of my suits, the relentless focus in my eyes, the way I never joined them for drinks after a 17-hour day. They didn't see the corrosion on the inside of the armor. They didn't feel the suffocating weight of it. They didn't know that every calculated move, every sacrificed weekend, every ounce of my life force was just another rivet hammered into the cage I was building around my own obsession. And the object of that obsession, the very architect of my self-imposed prison, was Theodore Sterling. He was my boss, the senior vice president of mergers and acquisitions, a man carved from granite and glacial ice, with a mind that moved like a predator and a voice that could strip a balance sheet bare with 2 clipped syllables. He didn't walk into rooms. He changed their atmospheric pressure. I had spent 243 days cataloging him, studying him with the frantic, secret intensity of a theologian decoding a holy text. The way his left eyebrow arched a fraction of a millimeter when a subordinate disappointed him. The precise, resonant timbre of his voice before his first coffee of the day. The scent of sandalwood and clean, cold cotton that clung to him like an aura. This trip to New York was supposed to be the culmination of it all. The apex deal. The one that would redefine the company's future and solidify his legacy. My legacy, too, if I played my part correctly. We were the 2-man advance team, sent to finalize the pitch for the board of a titan of industry. For 72 hours, we would be locked in a feedback loop of data, strategy, and relentless pressure. The company, in its infinite wisdom and pursuit of fiscal prudence, had booked us a suite. 1 suite. A shared living space, 2 separate bedrooms. A war room, they called it. A necessity for round-the-clock collaboration. I called it a containment unit, and I was walking into it willingly. Knowing the integrity of my armor was already compromised. Knowing that 72 hours of sustained, inescapable proximity to the source of my affliction might not just crack the metal, it might atomize it. The elevator ride up to the penthouse floor was a study in pressurized silence. The air thrummed with the whine of the cables, a sound that vibrated deep in my teeth. Theodore stood beside me, not looking at me, his gaze fixed on the glowing numbers as they ascended. He was a statue of bespoke charcoal wool, his profile sharp enough to cut glass. I could feel the heat rolling off his body, a dry, clean warmth that felt more potent than the stale, recycled air in the small space. My own body was a traitor, my heart hammering against my ribs in a frantic, panicked rhythm that felt loud enough to be audited. Breathe, Elijah. Professionalism. It's a job. The lie was already starting to fray at the edges. The bell chimed, a soft, polite sound that felt like a gunshot. The doors slid open onto a hushed, carpeted hallway. Theodore moved first, his key card already in hand. He swiped it with an efficient, practiced motion, and the lock clicked open with a sound of finality. He pushed the heavy door inward, holding it for me, a gesture of professional courtesy, nothing more. But as I passed him, my shoulder brushed the sleeve of his jacket. The briefest, most insignificant of contacts. The wool was fine, unimaginably soft. The jolt of it was anything but. It was a spark, an electric current that shot straight down my spine and pooled, hot and heavy, in my gut. My breath hitched. For a terrifying half-second, I thought I might stumble. He didn't seem to notice. He was already inside, his briefcase clicking onto a polished marble console table. "Right bedroom is yours," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. He didn't turn around. "I'll be working in the main room. We have a prep call with legal in 30. I stood frozen in the entryway, my hand still tingling from the phantom touch. The suite was beautiful. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, godlike view of the Manhattan skyline. The furniture was minimalist, expensive, all clean lines and muted colors. It was a place of power and isolation. A gilded cage suspended 50 stories above the world, and he was in it. With me, I retreated to my designated room, closing the door with a soft click. The sound did nothing to muffle the reality of his presence. I could feel him on the other side of the wall, a gravitational force pulling at the very structure of my composure. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door, my eyes squeezed shut. This wasn't a war room. It was a crucible. And I had the sickening feeling that I was the one about to be tested to my breaking point. The armor felt thin, brittle. 243 days of control felt like a distant, historical fact, irrelevant to the crushing immediacy of the next 72 hours. The lie was that I could survive this. The truth was, I was already starting to burn. The first breach was subtle, an erosion, not a shatter. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light outside the vast windows and the rising tide of empty coffee cups on the glass table between us. We worked in a state of suspended animation, a bubble of pure, unadulterated focus. The numbers swam before my eyes, synergies, valuations, risk assessments. I spoke them aloud, my voice a steady, professional monotone. He would counter, challenge, refine. His mind was a scalpel, and mine was the whetstone. We were a ruthlessly efficient machine. That was the narrative I clung to. But the machine had ghosts in it. Around the 8th hour, sometime after midnight, he loosened his tie. He didn't remove it, just tugged at the knot. A small, human gesture of fatigue that felt like a seismic event. He undid the top button of his stark white shirt, revealing a sliver of his throat. I saw the faint, rhythmic pulse just below his jawline. My own throat went dry. I forced my eyes back to the spreadsheet on my laptop, but the image was seared onto the back of my eyelids. The numbers blurred. All I could see was that small, vulnerable patch of skin, the steady, living beat of him. The air in the room thickened, became heavy with unspoken things. The professional script we had been following so rigidly had just been subtly, irrevocably edited. He stood up, stretching. The fabric of his shirt pulled taut across his back, outlining the hard lines of his shoulders. I tracked the movements, my focus so absolute it felt like a physical touch. He rolled his neck, a low sigh escaping his lips. It was a sound of pure exhaustion, unguarded and raw. It wasn't the voice of Theodore Sterling, SVP. It was the sound of a man, tired and under pressure. It hit me with the force of a physical blow. "Coffee?" he asked, his back still to me. My voice was a husk. "I'll make it." I escaped to the small kitchenette, my hands trembling slightly as I measured out the grounds. It was an absurdly domestic act in this temple of corporate warfare. The hiss of the machine filled the silence. I was acutely aware of him moving around in the main room, the soft scuff of his leather shoes on the hardwood floor. Every sound was magnified, every detail imbued with a significance it couldn't possibly bear. "This is just work. This is just a colleague." The lies were getting weaker, more transparent. I brought him the mug, placing it on a coaster beside his laptop. Our fingers brushed as he took it. Another accidental touch. Another jolt of high-voltage current. His skin was warm, dry. The contact lasted no more than a second, but it stretched into an eternity in my mind. I could feel the faint calluses on his fingertips, the strength in his hand. He looked up at me. His eyes, which I usually saw as cold, calculating gray, seemed darker in the low light of the suite, shadowed with fatigue. The professional mask was gone. In its place was something else, something unguarded. He was just looking at me. Not as an analyst, not as a subordinate. Just looking. The held gaze. It felt like being stripped bare. He was seeing past the suit, past the perfect reports, past the armor. He was seeing the corrosion, the panic, the obsession. He had to be. My heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't look away. It was a magnetic pull, a force of nature holding me in its orbit. Does he know? Can he feel it? This madness radiating from me? The moment broke. He blinked, the mask sliding back into place. He murmured a thanks, and turned his attention back to the screen. I retreated to my side of the table, my entire nervous system screaming. The air was thick with static electricity. The boundary had been breached, not by a hostile act, but by a simple, shared moment of exhaustion. The fortress of my professionalism was compromised, and the enemy wasn't at the gates. He was already inside, and he just looked at me like he knew all my secrets. The next day was a blur of escalating micro-tensions. The universe seemed to conspire to shrink the space between us, to force contacts that sent my carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. We shared an Uber to a final meeting with the legal team, the black leather of the seats cool against my legs. The driver took a corner too fast, and Theodore's body shifted, his thigh pressing firmly against mine, for a long, agonizing moment. The heat from his legs soaked through the fabric of my trousers, a branding iron against my skin. I went rigid, my entire being focused on that single point of contact. The pressure was immense, grounding. He smelled of that sandalwood cologne, but underneath it was something more fundamental, the clean, warm scent of his skin. I wanted to drown in it. He shifted back as the car straightened, seemingly oblivious. "Tell me the revised EBITDA projections again," he said, his voice as crisp and detached as ever. I recited the numbers, my own voice a stranger's, coming from a great distance. My leg still burned where he had touched it. My mind was a civil war, one half coolly articulating financial data, the other half screaming in a silent, incoherent panic. Later, back in the suite, we stood over the same printed document, our heads bent close. I was pointing out a potential liability clause when I felt his breath on my neck. It was warm, ghosting over my skin, raising every hair on my arms. I froze mid-sentence. My carefully prepared analysis evaporated. All I could think about was the proximity, the sheer physical fact of him. His body heat was a furnace at my back. I could hear the soft, steady rhythm of his breathing, and for a delirious second, I felt my own breath trying to sync with his. It was an intimacy so profound, so terrifyingly unearned, that I felt a wave of dizziness. "Elijah?" His voice was low, right by my ear. It vibrated through my bones. I flinched back as if burned, bumping into the table. "Sorry," I stammered, my face flushing hot. Lost my train of thought. He gave me a strange look, a flicker of something unreadable in his gray eyes. Concern? Annoyance? I couldn't tell. The shutters were down again. "Focus," he said. It wasn't a rebuke. It was a command, spoken with a quiet intensity that made it feel like something else entirely. Focus here. On me. The sensory overload was becoming unbearable. The suite, which had at first seemed spacious, now felt like a shoebox. His presence filled every corner of it. The scent of his coffee on the air. The sight of his jacket slung over a chair, an intimate stand-in for the man himself. The low murmur of his voice on a phone call. The sound seeping under my bedroom door at night. A siren song pulling me from a restless sleep. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. My analysis of him became more frantic, more granular. I wasn't just observing him. I was deconstructing him, memorizing him. The fine lines that fanned out from the corners of his eyes when he was concentrating. The way he'd rub the back of his neck when a problem proved particularly stubborn. The almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw when the team in London sent back flawed data. These were the details that mattered more than any financial projection. They were the cracks in his own facade, the proof that he was human, breakable. And every crack I discovered made the pressure inside my own chest build to an excruciating degree. The most pivotal moment, the gaze that truly saw, happened late on the second night. The presentation was less than 12 hours away. We were both running on fumes and caffeine. The city lights glittered outside, a cold, indifferent audience to our private drama. I was staring at the screen, my eyes burning, when I felt his gaze on me. I looked up. He was watching me from across the table, his laptop forgotten. There was no pretense in his expression, no corporate mask. He just looked tired, and more than tired. There was a profound weariness in his eyes, a vulnerability that stunned me into silence. It was the look of a man carrying an impossible weight, and for the first time, wondering if he might drop it. He didn't speak. He just held my gaze. It was longer than the last time. An endless, silent conversation. In that look, I felt seen. Not just my competence or my ambition, but the frantic, desperate energy thrumming just beneath my skin. The look said, I see you working yourself to death. I see how much this costs you. You feel this pressure too, don't you? My armor didn't just crack. It dissolved. In that moment, he wasn't my boss, and I wasn't his analyst. We were just two men, trapped in a glass tower, on the verge of a victory or a precipice. And the distinction was becoming terrifyingly blurred. I felt a desperate, insane urge to cross the space between us, to put a hand on his shoulder and tell him it would be okay, to offer a comfort that was so far beyond the boundaries of our relationship, it was laughable. I held his gaze, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. I see you too. A muscle feathered in his jaw. He broke the contact first, looking down at his hands on the table. The silence that fell afterward was different. It wasn't empty or tense. It was heavy, full of the things we had just acknowledged without a single word. The shared burden, the shared exhaustion, the shared humanity. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I could never go back. The professional line had been erased. All that was left was this raw, terrifying, magnetic field between us. And tomorrow, we had to walk into a boardroom and pretend it didn't exist. The facade of the unshakable Theodore Sterling finally cracked just before dawn. I had retreated to my room for a few hours of what passed for sleep, but my mind was a high-speed rail of anxiety and adrenaline. The silence from the main room was what eventually drew me out. It was a different quality of quiet. Not the focused silence of work, but an empty, unnerving stillness. I pushed my door open a crack. The lamps were still on, casting long shadows across the suite. And in the center of it all, Theodore stood with his back to me, facing the immense window. He wasn't working. He was just standing there, one hand braced against the cold glass, his head bowed. He thought he was alone. His shoulders, usually so straight and broad, were slumped. The line of his back, even under the fine cotton of his shirt, spoke of a tension so profound it was almost a physical deformity. He looked smaller, mortal. I watched, unseen, my breath caught in my throat. This felt like a transgression, like stumbling upon a secret, sacred rite. He lifted his other hand and pressed the heel of it into his eye, a gesture of such profound, bone-deep exhaustion, it made my own chest ache in sympathy. He was breaking. The pressure of the Apex deal, the weight of the company's future, the sleepless nights, it was all culminating in this one, silent, desperate moment. The invincible man was faltering, and in that instant, my obsession underwent a chemical change. The frantic, yearning analysis, the desperate desire, it all coalesced and transmuted into something else, something fierce and sharp and overwhelmingly clear, a protector instinct. It was a primal, illogical surge of purpose. The rest of the world fell away, the board, the presentation, my career. The only thing that mattered was the man standing at the window, looking like he was about to be crushed by the weight of the city he was supposed to conquer. I moved without thinking. My feet were silent on the rug. I walked to the kitchenette, my movements fluid and certain. I didn't make coffee. I poured a glass of water, the sound of the running tap unnaturally loud in the quiet room. I walked over to him. He didn't turn, but I saw his shoulders tense. He knew I was there. I stopped beside him, not behind him. Unequal. I held out the glass. He didn't look at me for a long moment. He kept his gaze fixed on the waking city below. Then, slowly, he turned his head. His face was a wreck. The shadows under his eyes were dark bruises. The skin was pale, stretched taut over his cheekbones. His eyes, when they met mine, were stripped of all authority. They were just gray and lost. He took the glass from me. His fingers were cold, and they trembled slightly as they brushed against mine. He drank, his throat working. The sound was intimate, vulnerable. The risk models, he began, his voice rough, broken. There's a variable we didn't account for. Geopolitical. It's a 1% chance, but if it hits... He trailed off, shaking his head, not in negation, but in defeat. It won't, I said. My own voice was steady, calm. I had no basis for this statement. It wasn't an analytical conclusion. It was a promise, an article of faith. He let out a short, sharp breath that was almost a sob. You don't know that. I know that we've controlled for every contingency possible, I said, my gaze locked with his. I know the data is sound. I know the strategy is flawless. And I know you don't break. The words hung in the air between us. It was the most unprofessional, most emotionally loaded statement I had ever made to him. It was a declaration. He stared at me, his expression unreadable. The vulnerability was warring with a lifetime of ingrained control. I saw him swallow, the motion sharp and distinct. He was putting the armor back on, piece by painful piece. But I had already seen the man underneath. I could never unsee it. We leave in an hour, he said, his voice regaining its familiar clipped authority. But the tremor was still there, a faint vibration beneath the steel. He turned and walked towards his room, the glass of water still in his hand. He paused at the door. "Elijah," he said, his back still to me. "Yes?" He was silent for a beat. "Thank you." Then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him. I stood there, my heart hammering, the protector instinct still singing in my veins. The dynamic had shifted completely. I was no longer just the observer, the analyst cataloging his every move from a safe distance. I had stepped into the arena. I had offered him a shield, however small. I had seen his weakness, and instead of it repulsing me, it had bound me to him with chains of tempered steel. The obsession was no longer just a feeling. It was a function, a duty. And I would walk into that boardroom and perform it. Not for the company, not for my career, but for him. To hold the line, to make sure he didn't break. The final hour before the presentation was a descent into a surreal, hyper-focused state of being. We moved around each other in the suite, a silent, choreographed dance of preparation. The air was charged, humming with the energy of what was to come. We were no longer colleagues. We were soldiers, arming for battle. I straightened my tie in the mirror, but my eyes were watching his reflection behind me. He was shrugging into his suit jacket, the charcoal wool settling perfectly over his broad shoulders. He looked like the man I had first met, powerful, composed, untouchable. But I knew better now. I knew about the tremor in his hand, the shadows under his eyes, the ghost of defeat I had seen at the window. The armor was back in place, but I could see the seams. As he adjusted his cuffs, his eyes met mine in the mirror. Another held gaze. This one was different. It was stripped of the shock and vulnerability of the earlier encounters. It was a look of grim acknowledgment, a shared understanding. We do this now. I gave a single, sharp nod. The elevator ride down was the same pressurized silence as the ride up, but the quality had changed. It was no longer the tense silence of strangers. It was the loaded silence of co-conspirators. I was intensely aware of the less than 2 feet of space separating us. I could feel the magnetic pull, a physical force threatening to draw me closer. I clenched my fists at my sides, my knuckles white, fighting the insane urge to reach out, to place a hand on his arm, to offer a grounding touch. We walked through the marble lobby of the investment bank, our footsteps echoing in the cathedral-like space. We were led to a hallway outside the main boardroom. A polished mahogany door stood like a judgment gate. We had a few minutes. The board was assembling. The tension became a living thing, a third presence in the hallway. I could feel my own heart rate escalating, a frantic drumming against my sternum. I risked a glance at Theodore. His jaw was tight, his gaze fixed on the door. He was preparing to become the titan they all expected. Then, he did something that shattered my remaining control. He turned to me. His expression was severe, intense. "Elijah," he said, his voice low and urgent. He reached out and took my arm, his grip firm, almost painful. The heat of his hands seeped through my suit jacket, branding my skin. It wasn't an accidental touch. It was a deliberate, grounding act. A transfer of something. Pressure, or maybe strength. "When we get in there," he continued, his gray eyes boring into mine, "you follow my lead. No deviations. Stick to the script. The numbers are our shield. Understand?" It was a direct challenge, a command to retreat back into the fortress of professionalism, to re-establish the boundaries we had spent the last 48 hours dismantling. He was asking me to pretend that the shared gaze, the midnight confession of doubt, the trembling hand, had never happened. He was telling me to put my armor back on, and my entire being screamed in rebellion. I looked from his eyes down to his hand, still gripping my arm. The pressure was immense. It was the only thing holding me together, and the very thing threatening to break me apart. I could feel the static, the current, the perilous, addictive heat. This was the final threshold. The conscious choice. I could nod, retreat into my role as the competent analyst, and deliver my part of the presentation with flawless, soulless precision. I could rebuild the walls, bolt the doors, and spend the rest of my life remembering the feeling of his hand on my arm, the look of vulnerability in his eyes. I could choose safety, or I could choose the truth. The truth was that the numbers were no longer a shield. They were a lie. The script was a fiction. The only real thing in that hallway, in that city, in my entire goddamn life, was the unbearable gravitational pull between us. The obsession had become my operating system. It was no longer a secret, shameful part of me. It was the core of me. I looked back up at him. My heart was a slow, heavy drumbeat of inevitability. I was falling, and I had no desire to pull the cord. "Elijah?" he prompted, his grip tightening slightly. "Do you understand?" I couldn't speak. The words were stuck in my throat, a logjam of everything I had repressed for 245 days. So I just stared at him, letting my eyes say everything my mouth could not. I understand that this is unsustainable. I understand that I am past the point of no return. I understand that I will follow you anywhere. But I will not lie for you. An assistant opened the boardroom door. "Mr. Sterling? Mr. Hayes? They're ready for you." Theodore released my arm, but the heat of his touch lingered like a brand. He gave me one last searching look, a question in his eyes that I couldn't answer. Then he turned, the mask of the powerful executive locking perfectly into place, and walked into the boardroom. I followed him, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. I was walking towards my own execution, or my own salvation. At that moment, I truly didn't know the difference. The only thing I knew was that I was done pretending. The armor was gone. I was walking in naked, and the collapse was imminent. The boardroom was a chamber of polished wood and cold glass, overlooking the city from a terrifying height. A long, intimidating table was surrounded by a dozen stone-faced men and women, the titans of industry we were here to win over. They were the gods of this pantheon, and we were the mortals bringing an offering. The air was thin, smelling of expensive leather and quiet, ruthless power. Theodore began. His voice was everything it was supposed to be, confident, clear, commanding. He moved through the opening remarks with the effortless grace of a master craftsman. He laid out the vision, the grand strategy, the irresistible logic of the Apex acquisition. He was magnificent. He was a lie. I watched him, but I wasn't listening to the words. I was watching the tiny muscle that jumped in his jaw, a tell I now knew meant he was under immense strain. I was watching the way he kept his hands perfectly still on the lectern, a conscious effort to hide the tremor I knew was lurking there. He was performing, and it was the most breathtaking, heartbreaking performance I had ever witnessed. Then, it was my turn. And now, my associate, Elijah Hayes, will walk you through the core financial models and synergy projections that form the foundation of this deal. He turned to me, his eyes locking with mine. It was a cue. It was a plea. Stick to the script. Save us. I stood up. My body felt strangely light, disconnected from me. I walked to the lectern, my footsteps silent on the thick carpet. I looked out at the faces around the table. They were impassive, waiting, expectant. My meticulously prepared notes were on the screen in front of me. Charts, graphs, billions of dollars distilled into neat, clean lines. I opened my mouth. I was supposed to say, "Good morning," as you can see from the first slide, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was closed. The script felt like a foreign language. All I could feel was the weight of Theodore's gaze from the side of the room. It was a physical pressure, a tangible force. He was the sun, and I was a planet that had been knocked from its stable orbit, spiraling inward, about to be consumed by the fire. The silence stretched. A few board members shifted in their seats. Someone cleared their throat. I looked away from the board, away from the numbers on the screen. I turned my head and looked directly at Theodore, and the dam broke. The truth. My truth. The one I had kept locked in the deepest, darkest vault of my soul for 245 days, came pouring out. It wasn't a confession of love. It was uglier, more primal, more honest than that. "I can't," I said, my voice a raw, cracked whisper that carried in the acoustically perfect room. Every eye in the room was on me. I saw confusion, then annoyance flash across their faces. I didn't care. I wasn't talking to them. I was only talking to him. These numbers, I gestured vaguely at the screen, a meaningless collection of pixels. They're meaningless. They're a story we tell ourselves, a shield. My voice grew stronger, fueled by a terrifying, exhilarating clarity. But the foundation of this deal, the real foundation, isn't the data. It's him. I pointed at Theodore. A collective gasp, small and sharp, went around the table. Theodore himself went rigid, his face draining of all color. He looked like I had physically struck him. "For months," I continued, the words tumbling out, unstoppable. "Every projection I've run, every risk I've modeled, every late night and every sacrificed piece of my life. It wasn't for the firm. It wasn't for the deal. It was for him. It was about watching him work. It was about trying to understand how a mind like his operates. It was about getting close to—" I faltered, searching for the word. "To the fire." My gaze was locked on his. The rest of the world had ceased to exist. It was just the two of us, back in the glass tower. The truth finally laid bare between us. "I'm obsessed," I said, the word landing in the silent room like a grenade. "With his focus, with his control, with the weight he carries. This entire project, my entire professional existence, it has been an exercise in obsession. I can't stand here and talk about EBITDA when the only thing I can think about, the only variable that has ever mattered, is him. I can't pretend anymore." The surrender was complete. The walls hadn't just collapsed, I had detonated them. The silence that followed was absolute, profound, a vacuum in which my career, my reputation, and my future were being utterly annihilated. I felt a strange, light-headed sense of peace. I had finally told the truth. Then, chaos. The chairman of the board slammed his hand on the table. Voices erupted, a confused, angry babble. But I didn't hear them. I only saw Theodore. He moved. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his face a mask of cold fury and something else I couldn't name. He grabbed my arm, the same arm as before, but this time his grip was like steel. It wasn't grounding. It was punishing. "Out," he snarled, not at me, but at the room. He hauled me from the lectern, dragging me towards the door. The faces of the board members were a blur of shock and disgust. I stumbled after him, a puppet whose strings had just been violently cut. He shoved the door open and pulled me out into the empty hallway. He slammed the door shut behind us, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Then he spun me around and slammed me back against the wall. The impact knocked the wind out of me. He braced his hands on the wall on either side of my head, caging me in. His face was inches from mine, his gray eyes blazing with a terrifying, chaotic energy. He was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. My own breath came in ragged gasps. I was pinned, trapped. All the heat, all the pressure, all the terrifying proximity of the last 2 days was condensed into this one violent, explosive moment. I looked into his furious eyes, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I was relieved. "I told the truth," I whispered. I leaned my head back against the cool wall, a strange sense of calm washing over me. "You." His expression faltered. The fury flickered, and for a split second, I saw the raw, unguarded man from the window. The vulnerable man. He stared at me, his gaze dropping to my mouth, then back to my eyes. The space between us was electric, humming with the wreckage of everything I had just destroyed. He didn't speak. He just leaned in closer, the scent of sandalwood and ozone filling my senses. His breath was warm on my face. The world narrowed to this single point, this unbearable, climactic proximity. The embrace was not one of comfort, but of collision, a crash. And in the silent, echoing hallway, surrounded by the ruins of my life, I finally felt the fall end. The ride back to the hotel was a silent, suspended reality. We sat in the back of another black car, a chasm of unspoken words between us. I stared out the window at the blurred cityscape, my reflection a ghostly, transparent overlay. I had just committed professional suicide in the most spectacular way imaginable. I should have been terrified. I should have been drowning in shame and regret. Instead, I felt hollowed out, scoured clean. The constant, grinding pressure of the last 8 months was gone, replaced by a vast, quiet emptiness. The armor was gone. The lies were gone. All that was left was the raw, exposed truth, and the man sitting beside me, radiating a silence more profound than any accusation. He hadn't said a word since we left the building. He had navigated our exit with a cold, terrifying efficiency, muttering something about a medical emergency to the stunned chairman, and guiding me out before security could be called. Now he sat perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He was a statue again, but I knew it was a lie. Underneath that frozen exterior, a storm was raging. I had unleashed it. When we got back to the suite, the key card felt heavy in his hand. He opened the door and stood aside, a gesture that was no longer courteous but clinical. I walked in. The room was exactly as we'd left it, laptops open, coffee cups scattered, the evidence of our shared, intense work. It looked like a set from a play whose final act had just been catastrophically rewritten. He closed the door behind us. The click of the lock was a sound of finality. A sentence being passed. Now it comes. The firing. The condemnation. The disgust. I turned to face him, ready to accept my fate. But he didn't speak. He walked past me to the floor-to-ceiling window, the same one he had stood at before dawn. He stood with his back to me, looking out at the indifferent city. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. It was no longer the comfortable silence of shared understanding, but the tense, agonizing silence of aftermath. The air after a detonation, full of dust and the ringing in your ears. I waited. Minutes ticked by. My nervous system, which had been running on pure adrenaline, began to crash. A tremor started in my hands. My legs felt weak. I wanted to sit down, but I felt rooted to the spot, a defendant awaiting his verdict. Finally, he moved. He didn't turn around. He just spoke to the glass, his voice low and devoid of emotion. Everything you said in there, was it true? There were no more lies left in me. Yes. Another long silence. I watched the rigid line of his shoulders, waiting for the blow to fall. You've destroyed your career, Elijah, he said, still not looking at me. And you very likely destroyed mine. I know, I whispered. My voice was hoarse. He turned around then, slowly. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. The fury was gone, replaced by that same profound weariness I had seen before. He looked older. He looked broken. And it was my fault. A wave of real, gut-wrenching guilt washed over me. The first true consequence I had allowed myself to feel. Why? He asked. It was a simple question, but it held the weight of everything. Why risk it all? Why that way? Why me? I couldn't maintain the pressure, I said, the words feeling inadequate. The professional line. It felt like a lie. Being that close to you, seeing the pressure you were under, something had to break. It was either the deal or me. I looked down at my shaking hands. I broke. He crossed the room and stood in front of me. He was so close I could feel the heat of his body again. He reached out, not to strike me, not to grab me, but with a slow, deliberate motion. He took my hand. His fingers wrapped around mine, stilling the tremor. His grip was firm, grounding. It was the same touch he'd given me in the hallway, but this time, it held no challenge. It held something else. He looked down at our joined hands, then back up at my face. His gray eyes were clear, stripped of all artifice. He was just a man, holding my hand, in the ruins of our professional lives. You think you're the only one? He said, his voice so quiet I could barely hear it. You think I haven't felt it? This gravity? Every meeting, every late night. I told myself it was your ambition, your talent. Another lie. My heart stopped. The world tilted. Watching you, he continued, his gaze intense. The way you see things, the way you see me, it's a pressure of its own. It's the most terrifying and validating thing I've ever experienced. He let out a shaky breath. When you looked at me at that window this morning, no one has looked at me like that in years. Like I was just a man. Not a boss, not a shark. Just a man who might break. The new silence that fell was different. It wasn't empty or tense. It was full. It was a shared stillness, a quiet space built from the rubble of our deceptions. The unspoken pact was being forged in that silence. The professional relationship was dead. The future was a terrifying blank page. But in this room, in this moment, we were no longer boss and subordinate. We were just two men, finally telling the truth. He didn't let go of my hand. He just stood there, holding on, as if I were the only thing keeping him upright. And maybe I was. Maybe we were holding each other up. My journey from armored isolation to this moment of devastatingly vulnerable connection was complete. I had lost everything I thought I wanted: my career, my control, my carefully constructed identity. But as I stood there, his hand holding mine, the silence of the suite wrapping around us like a blanket, I realized I hadn't lost a thing. I had just discovered the only thing that was ever real. The fortress had been a prison. The armor had been a cage. And in the spectacular, catastrophic collapse of it all, I was finally, terrifyingly, free. The future was unknown, but for the first time, it felt like it might be ours to write, together.